before temples touched the sky, before the pyramids cast their shadows on the desert, the Egyptians believed a sacred truth, that humans were not separate from the gods, but reflections of them from the tears of eye. Mankind was born from the blood of battles. Kings were crowned divine. Each person lived in the shadow of the great gods, but also carried within them a fragment of that same eternal fire. To serve the gods was to serve the world. To honor them was to keep the Nile flowing, the sun rising, and life itself in balance. This is the story of Between Heaven and Nile, the story of gods and humans, a tale of how Egypt saw the bond between the mortal and the divine. Prologue: the restless children of Rain the beginning. When the gods still walked among mortals and the world was young, there was only harmony. The goddess Mart held sway balance, truth and order woven like an invisible thread through every moment of existence. The sun rose, the Nile swelled, the crops grew, and humans lived within the divine rhythm. For a time, it was enough, but harmony, though perfect, is fragile. Humans are restless creatures. They dream of more than what is given, and in their hearts flickers both wonder and rebellion. To the gods, especially to I, this truth was clear. He looked upon his children, these fragile beings of clay and breath, and knew that the sameness of existence, no matter how divine, would one day stir in them a hunger for change. Up until that moment, life had flowed in a single stream called Jget, the eternal sameness, a timeless stillness where nothing truly altered. In Jget, there was no birth and death as we know it, no seasons, no cycles, only a perpetual now, steady and unbroken. To the gods, Jget was order, but to mortals, Jget would become a cage, and so I, in his wisdom, gave to humanity a new form of time. Nihil was the cycle, the turning wheel, the endless rhythm of beginnings and endings. With Nihil came the dawn and the dusk, the waxing and waning of the moon, the turning of the seasons, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. Through Nihil, mortals would taste variety. They would know growth and decay, joy and sorrow, the sweetness of birth and the inevitability of death. I did this not as punishment, but as protection. For he knew that mortals who live only in eternal sameness would rebel against even the gods. Better to weave change into their lives than to let them tear it down with their own restless hands. Yet even this gift carried shadows, for with variety came longing. With cycles came endings. With freedom came disobedience. The children of I had been given time to occupy their hearts, but they would soon seek more, and so the first tension was born, between order and desire, between Mart's steady balance and humanity's hunger for difference, a tension that would echo through all of Egyptian myth, and through the lives of mortals who forever stood between heaven and Nile. Chapter 1: The separation of heaven and earth in the earliest age, before there were kingdoms or temples. The sky did not stretch above the earth, it pressed against it. Not the sky and Geb, the earth, were lovers locked in an eternal embrace. She arched her star-strewn body over him, and together they birthed the first generation of gods. But in their closeness there was no room for mortals, no air to breathe, no light to move freely. Creation was heavy, stifled, bound. I, perceiving the danger, gathered his court. His voice was steady, but his command would alter the shape of the world forever. Shu, son of my breath, god of the air, he said, it is you who must lift the sky from the earth. Hold not aloft, so that space may exist, so that order may endure. And so Shu obeyed. With arms that stretched like wind, he rose and pushed not upward, arching her body across the heavens. Her starry form shimmered as she was stretched higher, her fingertips and toes brushing the horizons. Below her, Gib cried out, his laughter and sorrow shaping the contours of mountains and valleys. His body twisted as rivers and plains spread across his chest. while Nut's lifted body became the vault of the cosmos, jeweled with stars. The gods strained, for the separation was not gentle. It was the tearing apart of two lovers who had never known distance. Shu stood between them, arms forever outstretched, the eternal mediator between sky and earth. From that moment on, there was space, a realm for mortals to live, breathe, and dream. But this act was not only practical, it was symbolic, for in lifting Nut above, I and his divine children created a boundary between gods and humans. Once, the divine had walked among mortals as kin, touching the earth with every step. Now, the heavens belonged to the gods, while the earth was given to men. This distance was both mercy and warning. Mercy, because mortals could live freely without being scorched by the constant presence of divinity. Warning, because the gods, though removed, still watched from above. The sky became not just a dome of stars, but a veil, a reminder that the divine was near, yet always out of reach. Thus, the Egyptians understood their place between heaven and earth, between Nut and Geb, between gods and men. Every dawn when Nut bent to birth the sun, and every dusk when she swallowed it again, the people remembered this first act of separation. For in that moment, the world became vast, and humanity was left to walk beneath the stars, looking upward, longing for what was now forever distant. Chapter 2. The appointment of Osiris and Ursa, the divine delegation. Order must be kept, the eternal flame, whose eye burns brighter than all stars, looked down upon the world he had shaped. Creation was no longer new, yet the balance remained fragile. The gods had withdrawn into the heavens above the sky goddess Nut, where they could watch but not interfere without cause. From that lofty realm, Oi summoned his court. His children Shu and Tefnut, the air and the moisture, stood at his side. Geb, the green god of the earth, reclined below, and Nut arched above, her star-filled belly stretched across the void. But the affairs of the mortal realm now required careful tending. It was time to entrust divine authority to one who would walk among mortals, and so I turned to his grandson. Ursa, said the great sun god, you shall rule the two lands of Kemet in our stead. You and your consort Set, who is both wisdom and magic, shall guide the people in our image. But remember, above all else, you must preserve Mart. The command was not given lightly. Mart was more than a goddess. She was the principle of truth, justice, and order itself, the sacred thread that wove heaven and earth, breath and time, star and soul. I's voice echoed like thunder in the air. Let there be no deviation, no rebellion, no wandering hearts. Let each mortal do only what they were born to do. Let the farmer till his land. Let the priest speak his prayers. Let kings be kings and servants be servants. For change is chaos, and chaos feeds Apep. Mart must reign. Osiris bowed in reverence, his green skin glowing with the breath of life and growth. Isis, veiled in mystery, stood beside him like moonlight beside flame. Commentary. The doctrine of divine or dirty Egyptian worldview prized stability above all. Social roles were fixed, inherited and sacred. The belief in Mart was not merely religious, it was political, societal, cosmological. Pharaohs ruled not by right of conquest, but by their capacity to embody Mart. Disobedience, revolution, even innovation, these were threats not only to kingship, but to the very structure of the universe. And so I's advice to Osiris was not conservative by chance. It was foundational. The gods feared that without limits, the world would collapse again into the watery chaos of none. The cycles of Neo-eternity through repetition gave life rhythm, day and night, flood and harvest, but within those cycles, all was to remain still, predictable, eternal. Ursa descends to Earth-hand. So it came to pass, from the high realms above Nut, Osiris descended to the Nile valley. The sky rippled as he stepped through its folds. Birds grew silent. The wind bowed low.
He did not come as a thunderclap, nor as a blazing chariot.
He came with seeds in his hand and war in his breath.
Wherever he walked, life rose behind him, barley from sand, papyrus from marsh, justice from confusion. The people of Kemet looked upon him not as God alone, but as shepherd, healer, judge.
He taught them the ways of the calendar, the keeping of time, the building of canals, the rites of the dead, and the virtues of balance. Beside him walked a Set, clothed
in stars. She whispered forgotten names into clay, shaped spells into songs, and taught midwives how to guard the breath of life.
Where Osiris brought the form of order, Isis brought its soul. The earth rejoiced for a time. Kemet knew harmony,
not ease for. Work was sacred, but meaning. The people lived not as animals, but as those made in the image of the divine. The farmers ploughed with reverence. The scribes wrote with awe. The temples hummed with praise. But in the shadows of the sky barge, another watched. Set, brother of Osiris, son of Nut and Geb, stood restlessly on the prow of Ai's sunship, swinging his blade at the chaos serpent Apep, day after day. Why him? He muttered. Why does Osiris walk among mortals, while I wage war in silence? Was I not born of the gods?
Am I not strong enough to rule?
Jealousy seeded itself like a weed in his heart, but the storm had not yet come, for now the sun
still rose.
The Nile still flowed, Osiris still ruled, and the gods, for a fleeting moment, believed order might last forever.
Chapter 3. The jealousy of Set, where thunder watches the Nile. Envy begins to whisper. The guardian of the sunly decree of Ai. Seth, also called Set, had long stood upon the prow of the solar bark, cleaving the skies by day and piercing the duet by night. His arms, made of storm and flame, never tired in battle. His eyes flashed with desert lightning, and his purpose, to strike down Apep, the great serpent of chaos, each time it rose to swallow the sun. This was no simple task, for Apep was no beast of bone and blood, but a living current of disorder, made from the first nothingness, from the breathless dark that once blanketed all things.
Each time I journeyed through the underworld, Apep emerged writhing, infinite,
hungry,
and each night Seth stood between the serpent's jaws and the light. He was called protector, defender, storm,
fury, but not king. The eternal struggleth battles were endless. One did not truly slay Apep.
At best, one delayed it. Seth's spear, gleaming with the rage of the red desert, would pierce the serpent's hide, only to have it reform the next night, rising anew from the black. I am your weapon, Seth, growled I, blood drying on his arms.
I guard your light with my life.
I kill chaos so the Nile may flow, and I, high upon his throne of fire, would nod. Yes, my son, without you, the day would not come, but Ai's praise was light.
A flicker, a passing warmth. There was no feast,
no song,
no crown. Each dawn, the world below rejoiced at the sunrise, and forgot who fought to deliver it. The seed of envy, and so envy, ancient and quiet, took root. Seth watched as Osiris walked the earth below, worshipped in temples of stone. His name
sung with gratitude.
The people of Kemet offered him wine and gold.
They bowed at the mention of Isis.
They carved his likeness into eternity.
And when they spoke of Seth, it was only as the distant storm feared, misunderstood. Kept at the edge of maps and myth, he began to ask himself questions he dared not speak aloud. Why is Osiris beloved for ruling mortals, while I am burdened with saving gods? Why must I suffer darkness, while he basks in green fields and praise? Do I not deserve to rule, to walk the land not as a sword, but
as a king?
He paced the solar deck like a lion in a cage, while Apep hissed below, and I, ever bright, sailed on in silence. The desert Seth was of the red land, the harsh desert that bordered the lush Nile.
Where Osiris was the river and grain, Seth, was sand and storm.
Where Osiris gave life, Seth endured what could not live, but even deserts have hunger, and Seth's hunger was no longer only for battle.it, was for recognition,
for dominion,
for balance tipped in his favor. He began to see Osiris not as brother, but as rival, not as a bringer of order, but as a lie wrapped in leaves. He watched Isis with her clever eyes.
He watched the people who danced for their green-skinned king.
He listened to I speak of Mart, of roles and restraint, of keeping everything in its place. But Seth had never liked cages, even golden ones. The first crack and sow, the first thoughts
of betrayal whispered into his heart like wind over stone. Not a plan yet, not a plot, just a shift in the air. The way a storm begins not with thunder, but with the silence before it. Soon that silence would break, and gods would bleed, but fall. Now Seth held his place on the sunship, blade in hand, rage beneath his ribs, waiting, watching, wanting more. Chapter 4, the Order of Mart, and the rebellion of men when truth was no longer enough. The balance trembled. The weighing feather before time had a face. Before kings carved laws into stone, there was Mart not merely a goddess, but a
principle. She was the breath of equilibrium that held the cosmos still, the feather of truth that kept the scales from tipping. Her name whispered more than justice. She was the harmony between river and sky, between silence and sound. She was order made sacred, the eternal agreement between gods and mortals. Alive by Mart was to walk the straight path, to speak truth, to honor vows, to give what was owed and take no more.
Every heartbeat, every harvest, every prayer was meant to mirror her symmetry, and
in the golden age of beginnings they did. The first fracture in the pattern, but mortals are creatures of clay and shadow. Time passed, seasons turned, and though the Nile still rose and fell with its sacred rhythm, something within humanity began to strain. Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps it was the weight of perfection.
Perhaps, like Seth, they began to wonder, why must we obey laws written
in the stars? Why should our place be fixed by the gods? What if we became gods ourselves? They whispered in corners. They gathered under moonless skies.
They questioned,
plotted, rebelled. The balance that Mart maintained so carefully began to quiver almost imperceptibly, like a breath held too long, and I, though high above, heard. He had seen this in the old cycles. He knew the signs. Unrest, growing like weed among grain. The ripple of pride just before the flood. The children of earth were no longer satisfied with near time that danced in seasons, celebrated change, and mirrored life's rhythm.
They wanted control. They wanted dominion. And some even dared to say, why should I rule us at all? The council and the judge Mentra gathered the gods in secret. They came in silence, Shu and Tefnut, Dib and Nut, Thuth the scribe, and even the hidden gods of shadow.
Together, they watched from beyond the veil of the firmament, gazing upon the humans below. I spoke, voice like fire. They have forgotten who gave them breath. They test the edge of chaos. They threaten Mart. What shall we do?
Some urged patience.
Others called for destruction. It was Isis, wise in magic and mercy, who hesitated. If you burn the garden for one weed, she warned, what harvest will remain? But the balance had tilted. Mart, though eternal, could not ignore the weight of rebellion. And so, I made a terrifying decision, one whispered in dread long after. The Eye of Wrath. Sekhmet unleashed from the sun itself. I summoned his fiercest. Embodiment Sekhmet, the lioness of flame, the unblinking eye of vengeance. She was not merely war, she was fury wrapped in divine justice, and she was beautiful.
And she was terrible, with claws of gold and breath like desert fire. Sekhmet descended to earth, a predator of those who had turned from Mart.
She hunted not like a god, but like hunger itself. Villages burned, fields turned to ash. Those who had plotted perished without sound. For Sekhmet struck before fear could scream. Blood wet the ground that had once fed them, and the gods watched. In silence, the frightened love of the gods, but even gods, in their omniscience, do not enjoy slaughter. I, who had ordered the reckoning, now wept as he watched the blood soak into the soil of Kemet.
He loved his creations even when they failed.
Him, especially when they failed him. But Sekhmet would not stop. She was intoxicated, bloodlust had overtaken her spirit, and she roared through the land like the storm of Seth and the fire of I made one. Fearing the end of humanity, I devised a trick. He commanded red-dyed beer to be poured into the Nile enough to flood the land.
Sekhmet, mistaking it for more blood, drank deeply and staggered. Her fury ebbed,
Her eyes dimmed.
her breath slowed, and in that moment of stillness, she slept, and so the world was spared. The wound that remained that the people survived. Something had changed. The gods now watched from above, more distant, more wary. The humans now remembered that love from the divine could also become wrath.
That those who brought light could also bring fire, and mark those still honored was no longer assumed. From that day, every soul born into the world would be weighed after death against her feather. No longer was order guaranteed. It had
to be earned. This was the bargain.
the scar beneath the skin of creation, and the gods never forgot how close they came to erasing their children.
Chapter 5, The Rule of Osiris and the Gift of Civilization. Gods walked among mortals and taught them how to live. The green crown of Osiris to his appointment by Osiris, called Auser by the people of Kemet, descended to the fertile
Lands between heaven and the Nile.
He did not come with thunder. He did not demand temples or tribute.
He walked softly, crowned not with fire, but with grain. Osiris was not only a king.
He was a teacher of life. To the early people of the two lands, the world had still been raw, lush, but wild, generous, but chaotic.
Nature had not yet been shaped into culture.
But Osiris brought form to the formless. He taught the people how to plant seeds at the turning of the flood,
How to read the Nile's rise and fall like a sacred pulse. He showed them how to harvest wheat, how to grind barley, how to bake bread in the heat of the desert sun. He gave them laws, not to punish, but to guide so that neighbor might live beside neighbor in peace. He built the first cities not from
stone, but from order.
And he said, to live well is to live in mart. Let your heart be as steady as the river's rhythm. Isis, the weaver of mysteries beside him, stood a Set, whom the Greeks would later call Isis, a goddess cloaked in midnight, crowned with magic, and filled with memory. While Osiris shaped the outer world, Isis shaped the inner one. She taught healing how
to use herbs to calm the fever, how to chant over wounds until the blood listened and the skin obeyed. She taught women how to give birth in safety and power.
She whispered to dreamers how to speak with the stars. She showed the people how to bury their dead with honor, so that the soul could find its way into the afterlife with dignity. But more than any spell, she taught devotion, that love was not weakness, but strength.
That loyalty was not chains, but wings.
That the most powerful magic was the kind used to protect. Isis was not only wife and queen, she was the first priestess, and every ritual after her echoed her voice, the sacred human awakening under their rule. The people of Kemet changed. They no longer cowered at the elements.
They began to walk upright, not only in body, but in soul. They looked at the stars and did not only see fire, they saw patterns. They marked time.
They shaped language.
They carved history into stone. Civilization was not born of accident.
It was a gift from the divine to the Egyptians. Every field of wheat was a hymn to Osiris.
Every temple was a mirror of the heavens. Every law spoken with fairness was an echo of the first order. Born from Mart, the gods were not far.
They walked among them, and though all remained, it mingled now with reverence, gratitude, and a sacred kind of fear, not of cruelty, but
of disappointing those who had given so much. The divine blueprint in temples across the land. Priests would later whisper, it was not man who built civilization,
It was the gods who lent him the tools. The Egyptians believed that every craft, every ritual, every symbol was first created in the mind of a god, and only later handed down to men. Even the word for truth and order, Mart, was divine. In origin,
to live a good life was not merely to be kind, but to be aligned with the sacred pattern of the cosmos. Osiris had shown them how, and for a time, Kemet thrived in harmony.
the cities hummed, the temples glowed, the harvests fed all, but even golden ages cast shadows, and far in the background, a jealous eye watched. Chapter 6. The betrayal of Sethir are stories so old they echo in the bones of stone temples. Tales so tragic, their grief can still be heard in the hush between desert winds, and none among them weighs heavier on the heart of Kemet than the betrayal of a User Osiris by his own brother. Set, god of storms and deserts, had once been a guardian. He stood vigil at the prow of Oi's celestial bark, cleaving through darkness, striking down the serpent Apep, chaos incarnate, night after night.
He was a god of war, yes, but also of protection. His blades held back oblivion.
His rage kept order intact, but eternity has a way of curdling the soul. He watched as the User walked the Nile with a gentle hand, teaching humans the ways of grain and law, of ritual and reverence.
He saw the people raise temples not to Set's blade, but to Osiris's wisdom.
They praised the flood, not the storm. They crowned the king who wore linen robes, not the one armored in thunder. And in that shadow, something dark bloomed. Envy. The quiet serpent coiled in Set's heart, and so he planned a grand feast in Osiris' honor. Set brought a gift, a beautiful chest, carved with sacred symbols and painted with starlight and lotus.
I offer this box, he said, to whomever it shall perfectly fit, one by one. The guests tried it.
Too long, too short, too wide, too narrow, until a User himself lay inside, and with a grin sharp as obsidian, Set and his conspirators slammed.
The lid shot, nailed it closed, and poured molten lead to seal his brother's fate. Before the gods could react, they cast the coffin into the Nile. Osiris was gone, and in that moment, Kemet fell silent. The river wept.
The crops refused to rise. The birds sang no songs. Even the sun seemed dimmed, as if mourning its friend. The harmony I had so carefully maintained trembled, as if Mart herself had inhaled sharply, uncertain of the balance. But Set was not finished. Fearing that Osiris's spirit might return, he hunted the coffin down the Nile.
When it washed ashore, and became embraced by the roots of a sacred tree, he found it split it open and tore his brother's body into pieces, scattering them to the winds and waters.
Each piece left as an offering to entropy. The gods watched, and for the first time, they saw in themselves the very thing they had feared in humans, the ability to betray, to destroy, to covet.
A divine heart had failed,
and the heavens were left
bleeding. This was no mere family quarrel.
This was the first death among the immortals, and with it, the world shifted.
For if even gods could be torn apart by jealousy and grief, what hope did mortals have? Yet not all was lost.
For the next chapter would not be written in blood but in love. Chapter 7. Isis the Protector. Horus the Avengercellence fell over Kemet. The land, once vibrant with the songs of temples and the hum of harvests, grew still. The death of Osiris was not just the loss of a god, it was the unraveling of a
sacred thread in the tapestry of the world.
And in that unraveling, a single figure walked alone through the dusk of myth and memory. She was veiled in linen and mystery, wandering among mortals as one of them.
Her name was Set Isis, the throne, the sorceress, the sister wife, the mother-to-be. She did not cry out in rage or raise weapons against her betrayer. Her grief took a different shape. As he became a pilgrimage, the mourning woman in the wind. She
moved through the western hills, where tombs whispered to the stars,
through papyrus marshes, where crocodiles slept and the reeds kept secrets,
In every village, the people saw only a grieving widow, her eyes rimmed with coal and sorrow.
But beneath her rags burned a divine will,
A love that defied death itself, guided.
By dreams and omens, Isis searched for the fragments of her beloved.
She gathered the scattered limbs of Osiris, each one sacred, each one laid to rest in a hidden shrine.
Every recovery was a resurrection in miniature.
Every piece, a vow. He
Will return.
We will be whole again. The gods watched in silence. Even I, from his distant perch in the sky, felt the pull of her devotion.
For while Seth embodied rage and chaos, Isis had become the very essence of divine fidelity.
She was no longer just a goddess, she was a force, a myth, a memory that could not be erased, the womb of magic. But there was one piece missing, the most vital of all. And yet, even this did not stop her dot in the hidden shadows of the world. Isis called upon her deepest magic.
She spoke the words before time, the spells that shaped stars and kindled breath in clay.
And through these rites, she did what had never been done. From love and sorrow, from brokenness and hope, she conceived a child. His name would be Heru.
To the Greeks, Horus.
To Kemet, the falcon-eyed heir, the child of two worlds, Horus was born in secret, his cries echoing through reeds on the edge of the Nile.
Isis raised him in exile, hiding from Seth's wrath, guarded by scorpions and loyal
priests.
She sang to him lullabies made of spells. She anointed his brow with oils older than the moon.
She fed him on courage and silence, and he grew, swift as wind,
sharp-eyed as judgment.
The promise of a broken world remade. The gods saw in him not just the son of Osiris, but the hope of mankind. For in him, love and justice mingled with fire and retribution. He was the rebirth of balance, the echo of Mart in a mortal frame. He was the answer to a wound that had festered too long. The myth within Osiris, in her grief, became more than a mother. She became a symbol of devotion that does not waver, of healing born from heartbreak, of the sacred feminine that binds
the world when men tear it apart. And Horus, in his silence, became more than a son. He became as the ones born into sorrow, shaped by loss, yet destined to rise with wings wide. This tale is no longer just a legend etched in temple walls. It is a mirror held to the human heart, for in every life torn apart, there lies the seed of new creation. In every grief born in silence, there hides a future hero. In every shattered dream, the chance to be reborn as light.
Chapter 8, The Trials of Horus and the Ennead's Judgment Justice among Gods. Echoes among mortals the clash of the falcon and the storm when Hero Horus, the falcon son of Osiris, came of age. He did not seek peace. The blood of his father
cried out from the earth.
The earth itself remembered betrayal. And so he challenged his uncle Seth, the red god, the lord of storms and chaos. Their war was not a single battle, but a saga of divine duels, each stranger and more mythic than the last. Sometimes they fought as men, sword against sword beneath a darkened sky. Other times, they took the shapes of hippopotami, thrashing in a sacred river for days on end. In one tale, Horus set sail in a golden boat, only to be deceived by Seth, who sailed a boat made of stone. Laughing as it sank, the earth trembled beneath their war. The Nile recoiled in silence. The gods grew restless, and at last, the fighting reached heaven's court. The Ennead convalesced upon the sacred mount of creation. The Ennead gathered 9 gods in judgment, tasked with deciding not just the fate of 2 gods, but the very shape of justice itself. There sat I, weary in his old age, sunlight dim behind his brow. There stood Shu and Tefnut, wind and moisture, kept the earth and not the sky. Osiris, silent in duet, watched unseen, and before them, Horus and Seth, arguments thundered in the chamber like monsoons. I am stronger, bellowed Seth. I have served on the solar bark, protected Oi from Apep, while this boy grew in hiding, I am the rightful heir,"
said Horus, son of Osiris, born of justice, of mourning, of legacy.
"The throne of Kemet is mine." The council wavered. Days turned to years. Some gods leaned toward Seth, seeing in him the might to rule. Others turned toward Horus, feeling the pull of destiny and righteousness. Even the gods could not agree. A mirror of earth to the ancient Egyptians, this divine court was no fantasy. It was a reflection of their own sacred courts, where pharaohs passed judgment and priests whispered counsel. The Ennead, in their debates and delays, showed the Egyptians that even among gods, truth must be argued, and justice is not easily won. It was not enough to be strong, Not enough to be born of divine lineage.
to rule. One had to prove worthy. In mind, spirit, and law, this was marked truth and balance. On trial, Isis intervenes once more, though forbidden to plead her case. Isis was not one to obey quietly. She came in disguise, first as an old woman, then as a radiant maiden.
She crossed the river in a ferryman's boat, offering a ring of gold for passage, and when she stood before Seth in secret, she tricked him into condemning himself, admitting that an heir of noble blood had the right to rule. When she revealed her true form, the council gasped, but the truth had been spoken. Even the trickster had confessed his guilt. The verdict of the god Seth raged.
In his fury, he struck the ferryman and severed his toes. But it was too late. The judgment had been made. Horus was crowned, not merely as heir, but as king of Kemet. Osiris, eternal and unbowed, would now rule the duet, land of the dead, as judge and guide of souls. Seth was exiled to the Red Lands, the desert beyond the fertile Nile, the place of chaos and unmaking. Thus the gods restored balance.
One ruled the living, one ruled the dead, one was cast into shadow. The falcon's triumphant Horus took the
throne. He did so not in triumph alone, but with a scarred heart and clear eyes. He had seen his mother weep.
He had faced loss, rage, vengeance, and mercy. He was not merely a warrior, he was a bridge between heaven and earth,
between justice and strength, between the grief of Isis and the silence of Osiris. His eye, once
stolen by Seth, had been restored by Thoth, scribe of the gods.
The eye of Horus would become a symbol not just of protection, but of wholeness reclaimed. Legacy etched in Stanito this day. The myth of Horus's trials lives on in the walls of temples, in amulets buried with the dead, in the very architecture
of Egyptian belief.
It taught them that justice may be delayed, but never denied,
that suffering may shape the worthy, and that even gods must answer to the truth. The trials of Horus were not just the struggles of a boy avenging his father. They were the initiation of kinship, the crucible from which civilization itself was reborn. In the court of the Ennead, the gods judged themselves, and through their judgment, they taught humanity what it means to rule wisely.
Chapter 9. Humans as reflections of the godchildren of I. Keepers of Mart beneath the eyes of the divinity, ancient Egyptians did not see themselves as separate from their gods.
They were not mere worshippers at the feet of stone idols, nor shadows in the wake of eternal power. They were mirrors, reflections, fractals of the divine. To life was not merely to exist under the rule of gods, but to embody them. The gods of Kemet laughed, fought, loved, and raged. They made mistakes, they grieved, they bled,
they healed, and so did humans. Divinity with human face, and like many belief systems that place gods on unreachable pedestals. The Egyptians told stories of gods who wept, of mothers who mourned, of sons
who avenged their fathers, and of brothers who betrayed. The sun god, feared betrayal, and wept when humanity turned against him. Isis, mother of magic, disguised herself and schemed to protect her son.
Seth, the storm brimmer, envied, killed, and then suffered exile. These were not abstract entities. They were archetypes of the human soul, our virtues and our vices projected onto celestial canvases. To be human, in the eyes of the Egyptians, was to live out the dramas of the gods on earth. Every love, every loss, every struggle echoed the stories written in the heavens. The children of Ra created humanity not as puppets but as offspring. He gave them the world, the Nile, the sun, and a spark of his divine fire. But with that spark came freedom, and with freedom, danger. Humans were capable of great reverence, but also great rebellion. They could honor Mart with clean hands, and just words, or defy her with pride and violence. This duality was not a flaw. It was the condition of being human. I saw it. He feared it. And yet, he let them live. He knew to create without risk is to create nothing worth creating. Keepers of Mermatmet was not just a goddess of balance and law. She was the breath that held the universe together, the pulse behind the Niles. Rise, the whisper between truth and silence, and though she was born with the gods, her care was entrusted to humans. It was human hearts that would one day be weighed against her feather. Human deeds that would either uphold or disrupt the cosmic rhythm, every act of fairness, every vow kept, every injustice mended. These were offerings not of incense, but of cosmic consequence. In temples and courts, in homes and fields, Egyptians knew they were not passive observers of the divine story. They were participants, and the responsibility was vast. The mirror of the divine in one hand, a farmer held a sickle. In the other, an offering to Osiris. In one heart, a woman mourned a lost child. In another, Isis mourned Osiris. In one courtroom, a judge raised his voice to defend the innocent. And somewhere beyond the veil, Thoth recorded the moment in eternal ink. Humanity was not beneath the gods, but woven into them. Each person carried within them the potential to echo Horus's justice, Set's rage, Hathor's love, and Nephthys' sorrow, a sacred mirror, fractured but divinith mythic landscape of Egypt reminds us. The gods were never meant to be perfect. They were never meant to be distant. They were, and are, reflections of us in our striving, in our failing, in our rising again. And as long as we remember that every sunrise is a gesture of eye, every act of justice a tribute to Mart, every here a silent echo of Isis, then we too are part of the sacred story, not merely created, but creators, not simply ruled, but entrusted. Entrusted to hold the balance, entrusted to carry the divine within us, and to walk the earth as echoes of the eternal, time renewing two threads of Timain, the sacred geometry of ancient Egypt. Time was not a single arrow shot into the void. It was not linear, nor did it evaporate into nothingness once past. Instead, it wove itself into two divine currents, each flowing in harmony, each essential to the rhythm of existence, JGT, the time of eternity, fixed, unchanging, immortal, the time of the gods in their statues, the time of truths that would never rot. JGT was the eternal present, the stillness of perfection, the backdrop of the stars, Neha, the time of cycles, turning, flowing, dying, and returning, the time of the seasons, the Nile's breath, the pulse of sunrise and sunset. Nihil was the heartbeat of earth, the rhythm of human life and renewal. Both were real, both were sacred, together. They held the universe in balance. The wisdom of Ra, the creator, saw what others did not. He knew that if humans lived only in JGT unchanging, perfect time, they would rot from within. Stability would become stagnation. Order would become oppression. Even the divine would grow dull in the absence of movement. And so, he broke the stillness. He seeded the world with Neha, time that breathed, time that danced. This is why the days rise and fall, why the fields green and brown and green again, why we mourn in winter and rejoice in spring. This is why death is not an end, but adore. A universe that breathes in the temples. Priests intone the same rituals every day, not to repeat the past, but to renew it. Every sunrise was I reborn. Every harvest was Osiris resurrected. Every love, every child, every act of justice was a thread in the turning wheel. The Egyptians did not fear the turning of time. They understood its secret, that in order to be immortal, a thing must die and return, just as the Nile floods and retreats, just as the sun sets and rises, just as gods fall, and their sons rise in their place. Humans within the wheelter live within Nile was to be part of the dance, to suffer loss and still find hope, to grow old and yet believe in tomorrow. But to forget Mart, to defy balance, to disrupt harmony, was to break the wheel, to fall into chaos. Thus, the task of humans was not only to live,
it was to remember, not to remember who they were, children of I,
keepers of time,
bearers of Mart when the wheel fails, and yet the myths warn us, even time, even the sacred balance, can falter. When Seth killed Osiris, the wheel stuttered.
When humans rebelled against I, the sky wept blood. Even gods can forget.
Even eternity can wobble. That is why the myths are told, not just to recount, but to recall, to remember what must never be forgotten. Epilogue, the eternal return jet and Nile are not opposites, but companions. The pyramid endures JGET, but the sun it reflects changes each hour Nile. The stars are fixed JGET, but the stories we tell beneath them evolve Nile. The gods live forever JGET, but their dramas repeat in every generation Nile. And so, the wheel turns, not because time is cruel, but because time is sacred.
Because each return is a chance to choose again,
to remember,
to restore,
to rise. Epilogue between heaven and Nile where the gods withdrew, but never vanished when the dust of divine was had settled, and the cries of gods no longer echoed through the valleys of Kemet. It might have seemed that the age of myth had ended. I
had withdrawn into the sky, his sun barge gliding across the heavens, distant but ever watchful.
Osiris had descended into Duat, veiled in shadow, crowned not in gold but in silence, and the other gods, once walking among men, had retreated to temples, to stars, to symbols etched in stone, but they were never truly gone. Between sky and rival humanity remained beneath the ever-turning stars, and along the breathing banks of the Nile we continue to live, to labor, to love. Not fully divine,
not wholly mortal, we walked between heaven and Nile, between the unseeable heights of the gods and the earthy cycles of grain and flood. We lived between the sigh of Nat, who arches over us, and the heartbeat of Geb, who feeds us.
We carried in our veins the tears of Isis, the fire of Sekhmet, the eye of Horus, the voice of Thoth, the gods within in truth. The gods had never left, they had become part of us. Their passions mirrored in our joys.
Their betrayals echoed in our wars.
Their
love endured in our families.
Their wisdom whispered in our justice. For what is Mart, if not a principle we are still tasked to uphold? And what is Set's exile, if not a warning written into the landscape of our own chaos? Why the myth remained story of the gods was never just about them. It was always a story about us, we who rise and fall,
we who mourn and remember, we who betray and forgive, we who fall to pieces and still, somehow, are made whole again. We do not simply hear the myth we enacted. Each generation becomes Isis, searching for meaning.
Each injustice awakens Horus. Each tragedy dares Osiris to rise again. And still the Nile flows, the temples may crumble, the statues may wither, but the myth endures, not because it is old, but because it is true, because every day, somewhere in the world, a mother weeps, a son avenges, a soul is judged, a balance is restored, because we are not apart from the divine we are its reflection between heaven and Nile, between silence and song, Between order and chaos we live the myth still. So now, as the sun sets over the Nile and shadows stretch long across the sands of Kemet, we close the scroll of this ancient tale. But the story does not truly end, for every time we choose justice over power, every time we mend what was broken, every time we walk with reverence through the chaos of life, we echo the steps of gods. The myths of Egypt were never just about distant deities. They were about us flawed, hopeful, proud, afraid, courageous. About the eternal dance between the divine and the human, between destruction and rebirth. You too. Walk between heaven and Nile. So carry Mart in your words. Speak truth like Thoth, love fiercely like Isis, and when the time comes rise again, like Horus, because in the end, the gods are not gone. They are simply waiting in the stories we keep, in the choices we make, in the balance we restore. Thank you for listening. If this journey stirred something ancient in you, if you felt the heartbeat of myth within your own, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this story. There are more to come. More gods, more legends, more truths hidden in time. Until then, walk gently, walk wisely, walk with wonder between heaven and Nile.